Today I am talking about a game that is very interesting. And over the course of playing it, it really became one of my favorite games. And that game is, of course, Avernum Escape from the Pit. Now, this game does have very old-style graphics. It also has kind of old-school gameplay. It's a little rough around the edges, to be perfectly honest. But still, there's something else to it. There's something more. There is a charm to it, and certainly an enjoyability and a real sense of freedom that you really don't find in a lot of RPGs these days. To start at the beginning, Avernum Escape from the Pit is a turn-based role-playing game published by Spiderweb Software back in December of 2011 for the Mac and April 2012 for PC. I, of course, did not play it until the first part of this year, being 2022. Now, it's a remake of an earlier game also called Avernum that was published way back in the year 2000. And that, in turn, was a remake of a game called Exile, Escape from the Pit, which was published in 1995, and that was the original version of this game. And I believe, if I've got my facts correct, that is the first game that Spiderweb Software published. Now, that might seem like a lot of redoing it, right? A lot of touching up and republishing. And I've seen some interviews with Spiderweb Software owner and developer Jeff Vogel, where he actually jokes about the fact that most of the games that they've published are remakes of earlier titles. One thing I respect, though, is that he goes into great detail to explain the fact that when they do a remake, they don't just spit it back out. They don't just, make it look different and throw it back out. They actually completely redo the game. They kind of rebuild it from the ground up. And so, it's not half-hearted. It's really a labor of love to give life to an older title and to update it for modern systems and introduce it to a new audience. And that's something that I respect. Now, Spiderweb Software games, if you've ever played them, you'll agree that they're pretty recognizable. They have simple graphics, they usually feature very large open worlds, and they have extensive storytelling. And to be honest, it's quite remarkable to me that Jeff Vogel makes the games himself. He outsources some of the graphics, I believe, to freelancers, and in the first version of Exile, his wife actually made some of the graphics for him. But the writing and coding and stuff, I believe that's just Jeff. Now, as we kind of get in here a little bit more, I want to give you fair warning that there are spoilers towards the end of the video, and a little bit throughout, but if you're really looking to avoid spoilers, there's that will be mentioned at the end. And I'll give you fair warning so that you can skip over or just avoid it altogether. Now, if there are spoilers kind of in this first part, it's going to be in the gameplay footage that you're watching. That being said, I don't really think there's anything here. I've watched it through a few times, just kind of casually, not taking great pains to pay attention to what's going on. But I think what you're watching is basically kind of watered down. I don't think there's a whole lot there that's going to be a spoiler. But if that is something that's you're sensitive to, then you can always just listen to this. What I'm saying right now and throughout doesn't necessarily correspond directly to the gameplay footage that you're watching. And so if you listen to this like a podcast or what have you, then that wouldn't be an issue for you. Now, there's a few other things I want to say. The first is that I really did enjoy this game, and I become critical of it at some points. And those criticisms are honest, and they are true, but to me, they don't really make the game not worth playing. They don't ruin the experience. So be aware of that, because I kind of hammer hard on some of those things. And I believe that they deserve to be hammered hard on. We should be free to criticize things as we see fit, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad game. I really, really like this game, and I don't want you to get the wrong idea there. Also, this is just my opinion. I do have an opinion, and I assume that you probably have different opinions than me, and that's totally fine. God bless us all. And I'm not trying to convince you that this is a great game. I think it is, but really, I'm just some guy who played it and am sharing my experience with you. Now, if you're interested in the series, my advice is not to take my word for it or take anybody else's word for it. My advice is to try it out yourself. And you can get a free demo, a long demo, from the Spiderweb Software website. I've included some links down below for you to check out. And with that, you really have nothing to lose. You can also get the original games, the ones from way back in the 1990s. You can get those for free, and they give them away on the website, so you're not pirating or anything. It's Spiderweb Software giving those away for free, and there's a link for that as well. The last thing I want to say is that I played through this exactly one time, and I did so blind, which means that my experience with the game is actually fairly limited. I spent several hours. I spent about 63 hours in the game world, and so I have that much experience with it. But there are people who know this game much better than I do. They play multiple times with multiple types of parties, and they make multiple types of decisions throughout the game. And we'll get into that a little bit more later too. But if you want a fuller understanding of the game, go find those people and let them be your guide. This is really kind of just an introduction and a sharing of my experience. All right, let's get into this a little bit more. In the world of Avernum, the major power that controls the surface world is called the Empire. And it is ruled by a man named Emperor Hawthorne, who rules with an iron fist. And the cruelty of the Empire is illustrated in the way that they handle dissent, because anybody who agrees with Emperor Hawthorne, or any of his bureaucrats, are summarily banished to the unforgiving depths of Avernum, which is a subterranean world that exists far below the surface. And in your wanderings throughout this large open world, you'll see just how benign some of the Avernite offenses can be. In fact, you'll meet a man who was banished simply for not smiling enough. As for your crimes, they are left intentionally vague, because the intention is that you will decide for yourself how you got there, what you did to get yourself there. And you have the freedom to roleplay as though you were a band of heartless murderers, or perhaps that you fell in love with a bureaucrat's spouse, or maybe you just looked at someone wrong. I do have a tip for newcomers, though, and my tip is this. You ought to decide at the outset why your little band of adventurers is in Avernum, what they did wrong, whether that be something completely benign, or whether they are dangerous murderers or bandits, or whatever you want to do. But I do think that you should make that choice at the outset, because it may inform, in fact, I think it will inform the options and decisions that you make. I basically assumed that my party were innocent and good people throughout my playthrough, and that heavily informed not just the choices that I make, but how I felt about those choices. And if I played again, I think that I would actually choose a different choice. I think I'd choose to be dangerous. Maybe I was banished to Avernum because the people truly perceive me as a danger. And then I would make different choices, and I would feel differently about those choices. So before we dig into the party, though, I want to talk briefly about the different races that you'll find in Avernum, because although your party is mostly made up of humans, actually, yes, it is completely made up of humans. Despite that, though, there are several races that exist in the depths of Avernum. First, there is the Nephilim. This is a cat-like race. Think Khajiit from the Elder Scrolls series. They're a tribal race, and they revere strong magic users. Then there's the Slithzerakai. Now, the Sliths are a lizard people, and from my playthrough, they actually have quite a bit more lore and nuance to them than the Nephilim do. Most Slithzerakai are hospitable to humans, but there are a few settlements that you'll find dotted around here and there where they're actually quite friendly, and they differentiate themselves from their more violent cousins. Of course, this is a fantasy game, so we have to have goblins. And goblins are never friendly. Sometimes, though, they will avoid you rather than being outrightly hostile, but most of the time they are hostile. And they do actually have kind of a society of sorts. They have leaders, and it's not always obvious how those leaders are chosen. It's not necessarily like the they're led by the most violent individual necessarily. There are also giants and ogres, which are both kind of big and dumb brutes. And there's dragons in Avernum. And the dragons are interesting. They're interesting because most of the dragons that you'll find out in the wild are going to be hostile. And they're going to attack you and you're going to fight them. But there are these mighty dragons that you find throughout the game. And these are different. They are bigger, for one, much bigger. But in addition to that, they're not necessarily hostile. None of them come off immediately as hostile. And although you can be hostile with them, there's always a way to avoid hostility when you're talking to these mighty dragons. And some of them are quite helpful. And their different personalities and temperaments vary, and so you'll learn about that as you play. The last major race that I want to discuss is the demons. The demons have a very strong presence in the game. They have a hierarchy, they have internal politics, and even a culture. And these things make them a little bit more interesting than your typical run-of-the-mill bad guys. And in fact, when you actually finally learn about why the demons are hostile, you kind of get it. You're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. I would probably be upset too. You know, one other thing that I should talk about actually is the undead. There are creatures such as vampires, zombies, ghosts, liches, etc. And while they don't have a society or hierarchy per se, they are often very interesting characters in their own right. They have interesting and engaging backstories that you can learn about. Sometimes you'll meet a ghost and you'll hear about their story and you'll actually feel sorry for them. And sometimes those ghosts then attack you and you feel bad about having to take them out. And other than those, of course, there are various creatures, constructs, factions, and people that you'll meet along your journeys in Avernum. Now, the story of Avernum is pretty simple, and we kind of outlined it already. You are a 4-person band who were banished to Avernum for unstated reasons. And as far as overarching story goes, that is about it. You can then do whatever you want to. You can work to rid Avernum of evil. You can help people to thrive. You can side with various factions. You can put down rebellions. You can help city-states gain independence. And of course, you can always try to find a way out of Avernum. And you can try and get revenge on the Empire. Towards the end of the game, there are certain elements that arise that prompt you to make a choice. And it's not a binary choice. It's not like do this or do that. It's like, here are some options, and you can do all of them, or you can do none of them, or you can do a subset. And I don't want to go too much more into it than that because I really don't want to get into spoiler territory. But my point is that the game gives you some direction here and there, if you want it. But it's also possible just ignore that and do whatever you want for a while. In fact, that's basically what I did. For the first 20 hours or so of gameplay, I essentially just kind of lost myself in completing side quests. And really, that's a testament to how well written the side quests are, because I never really felt bored. And there was a point, probably about 25 hours in or so, that I realized that I should probably have some overarching goal to work for. And at about that point, I actually met someone who introduced a new element into the game that kind of put me on that path. But I was never forced to do anything. I could have ignored those promptings from different characters. I could have just continued doing what I wanted. There really is a lot of freedom. Now, because of that freedom, and there's really no what I would call like a linear roadmap. There are a few chain quests, I would say, where you do one and then that prompts you into another one, and that goes on until you kind of complete the story that those quests are telling. But that's not to say that Avernum is a game without a story. there's some emergent gameplay in that you kind of create your own story as you go. But as for the game, it is made up of stories, and you might have caught on to that when I was talking about the quests. Now, the quests kind of, you don't complete a quest chain, you complete a story, or you discover something new. And there are people and beings everywhere, and they all have stories to explore. They all have unique motivations and desires. And for me, playing through, when I was exploring those things, it was surprisingly satisfying and engaging. Now, exploration is a huge part of this game. And one of the great joys that I found in playing was just wandering around and exploring the little nooks and crannies that exist in the world. I did that right up until the end. Avernum's a big place, and there are little caves and side paths and settlements everywhere, and at some points in the game you get things, whether those be abilities or items, that allow you to explore places where you were barred off before. Let me give you an example. Early in the game, I found myself walking into a cave, just walking around and exploring, and I found a little cave, and I walked in, and I got utterly destroyed. The mobs there were they were higher level than me by quite a bit, and they just completely destroyed me. And so I left. I assumed that I would go back there at some point, probably in a quest chain to do something or another. But otherwise, I just kind of forgot about it, because there's tons of caves in the game, and that was just one among many. And then about 20 hours later, after completely forgetting about that cave and having never gone back because there were no quests that ever led there, I went out exploring and I found it again. And by now I was much more powerful, and I was able to take out the mobs that so mercilessly destroyed me last time. And I was able to explore this cave, and I was able to explore the story behind the cave. I love that the game really doesn't spell it out for you. Jeff Vogel, I guess, is fine with the idea of players not seeing a lot of the content that he wrote, because there's a lot of content that is interesting and engaging, and the quests just never take you there. And if you're only going where the quests point you to go, you're going to miss out on some of the very best parts of this game. The only way that you find those most memorable parts is through exploration, and maybe that's what makes them so memorable, is that you just find them on accident, and you find something, you find a new area, and there's people there, or there's some sort of NPCs there, and you learn about the area, and you learn about them, and you maybe pick up a side quest or two, sometimes not, but usually there's something. And one thing that I love is that the game always rewards you for exploring. It doesn't matter if you're just exploring a non-essential path in a dungeon, or if you're out in the world and you stumble onto a hidden cave. The game always rewards you, to the extent that the few times it does not, every once in a very great while, you'll hit a dead end and it will just be a dead end. And that happened so rarely that whenever it did happen, I would scour the area around, sure that I'd missed something. And sometimes I had, and sometimes I hadn't. And it never detracted from the joy of exploring to find that I hadn't discovered anything tangible. It's still fun to go around and explore. Let's talk about combat a little bit. Avernum uses a turn-based combat style, and as I've alluded to, you are a group of 4 adventurers, presumably with different skill sets, strengths, and weaknesses. And in a typical encounter, what will happen is your characters will take their turn, and then the enemies will take their turn. Now, a turn consists of 2 actions. So you can move, or you can complete a minor action, such as drinking a potion or using some kind of spell scroll. Or you can attack, and you can do any 2 of those things. And when a party member attacks, however, it doesn't matter if they've done anything else first. Their turn is over once you attack. So be aware of that. Now, this is also a grid-based game, and so positioning is important. And in typical fashion, you want to have kind of your beefy melee guys up front, and your spellcasters and ranged guys in the back. It is a little bit more nuanced than that, though, because you're always fighting through a building, or through a corridor, or through tunnels, or what have you. And so, for example, you have some buffs that your priests can cast, but their range is limited, and they require line of sight. And so if your tank is too far away or around a corner, he won't get those buffs. And this is something that you want to remember, because there are times when you may walk through a door and find a fight waiting for you on the other side of the door. Now you have your party cut in half. Some of them are on one side of the door, some of them are on the other side of the door, and the door may be open, but that doesn't mean that your tank hasn't gone around the corner or isn't out of the line of sight or something. And so you may cast something and not everybody will get it. And that happens from time to time, and that's something to be aware of. So at the same time, though, you don't really want to bunch your people together, because there are enemies that have AoE attacks, and bunching together, you're just going to get destroyed. One of the interesting things about combat, though, and the reason I actually don't want to go too much into combat, is because combat is variable. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach the combat in this game. There are a lot of different enemy types, there's a lot of different enemy behaviors, and a big part of enjoyment is just figuring that out, mastering that, and coming up with your own style for meeting each combat encounter. So I'm really not going to go too much into that. I'm just going to leave it there and say that in order to be successful, there's really only two things you have to do. You have to be willing to learn from your mistakes, because you'll make mistakes, and you just have to have fun, because it is fun, and it's fun even when you die. Well, it can be frustrating when you die, but it's fun to figure it out. Now, Avernum has over 52 different spells and melee abilities. For example, there's like priest spells and mage spells and battle disciplines, and those are kind of the three main trunks. And most of these abilities are pretty unique, they're pretty interesting, and in addition to those abilities, you also have skill trees. There are combat skill trees and magic skill trees, and there's a few miscellaneous skills thrown in as well, so things such as luck and first aid and cave lore and such. And none of these skills are really activated skills. It's just like passive upgrades and enhancement to the way your characters play. And in addition to those skills, there's also traits. Now, traits are very focused character upgrades. For example, let's say you want to build a tanky soldier. So in the skill tree, you might invest in something like hardiness, which decreases the amount of damage that you take. Then you might choose, for your trait, you might choose something like Challenger, which increases your aggro, meaning more enemies are going to want to attack your soldier rather than any other character. Now, for a beginner, I would say that, at least in the early game, you really do want your characters to specialize. If you have a mage, they should be focused on mage spells. If you have a priest, they should be focused on priest spells, etc. But the thing is, once you get in, once you kind of figure it out and know what you're doing, you can create custom classes. Even if you choose a starting class, you can almost multi-class. Like, you can kind of branch out into other things. You don't always have to stick with that. If you create a priest, you don't always have to only invest in priest skills and spells. And so, really, there is freedom there to do whatever you want. For example, you can create a sword mage. You can create a mage who is proficient with both spells and melee, and can wear heavier armor. You can also create like a glass cannon type of build that has tons of spell power, but just isn't very strong and can't really take a hit. And one of my characters was like that. And when I played, I actually just kept the default classes. So that gave me a soldier, a rebel, and you may hear me call my rebel an archer, because I did use them basically as an archer through the playthrough. And if I could go back, that's actually one of the very few things that I would change about my playthrough is I'd probably use them more as like a rogue rather than an archer. But you live and you learn. I also had a priest and a sorceress. And something that I did, or I guess something that I experienced in my playthrough, was that my soldier was built to be nice and tanky. He could take a hit. He could take all sorts of hits, whether it be magic or melee or whatever. He was resistant to a lot of types of attacks. However, I failed to really fortify him against mind-based attacks. So that meant that whenever an enemy would use the spell called Charm, which of course causes one of your party members to fight against you, they would goodness, can I talk today? They would invariably choose the soldier. And he was always just hopeless to resist. And no joke, every single time that he was charmed, he would go over and just take a swing at the sorceress, and she'd be dead. And luckily you do, later on, get some spells and stuff that kind of help you deal with that sort of thing. And if I had built my party differently, I wouldn't have had to worry about it in the first place. But it just goes to show you that your build matters, and there's variability in how you play the game. Now, I do have some complaints about combat. And, maybe I'm nitpicking, but I did die to these issues more than once. The first is that the pathfinding is atrocious. Now, at the time that I kind of sat down and wrote out my notes for this game, that was one of the things that I wrote down, was that the pathfinding was bad. And I'm going to explain why I felt that way. But I've recently been playing Icewind Dale 2, and I'll do a video on that game whenever I finish. But the pathfinding in Icewind Dale 2 is truly bad. Truly bad. And, it's one of those old Infinity Engine games, and unlike, Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale 1, Icewind Dale 2 did not get an enhanced edition, and so, maybe I'm just dealing with some of that, but the pathfinding in Icewind Dale 2 is bad, and I felt bad as I was experiencing this, that I had made such a big deal about it in talking about Avernum. But to be fair, Avernum is, let's see, how much older? About 9 years older, or 9 years newer, rather. 9 years younger than Icewind Dale 2. And so, it should be better, and it is better, but it still has its issues. And that issue, for me, that I experienced was that characters can walk through one another's grid squares, but only if you explicitly tell them to, step by step. That means click by click. Now, many times I would try to move like my fighter in front of my spellcasters, for example, if I was like attacked from behind or something. But because there wasn't a clear path, and because I hadn't specifically clicked on each and every cell to get to the destination, he would suddenly run way out of his way, as though he knew like some other way to get to the space that I'd specified. And a lot of times when he did this, he would run into a room that I hadn't explored, and it was full of mobs that I didn't even know were there. And suddenly now I have 2 fights on my hand. And even when that didn't happen, it was just so annoying, because I would lose 2 turns basically for him. He would run away for a turn, and then I'd have to waste another turn to bring him back to the battle. And it happened to all my characters really, but it was especially egregious when it happened to the fighter, because now he's not able to be the tank of the group, right? He's just like off doing his own thing, I guess. And so it was a challenge, and it happened more than it should have. Like I said, going back and playing Icewind Dale 2 and kind of experiencing the pathfinding challenges involved in that game, this game doesn't seem as egregious, but I would still say that it happened more than it should have. And sometimes you find yourself in this game fighting in tight, winding passages, and it's not always clear whether a character has a clear path or not. And moving them step by step is tedious, always. And so doing it just to be sure, like, it's something that you'll avoid. It's not something that you'll, maybe I don't have to this time. And it's not something that you think about a lot either, because honestly, this isn't a problem all the time, but it's a problem enough that it's annoying. It's enough that you'll forget that it's a problem, and then it will be a problem and you'll die, basically. Now, to be fair, they have actually fixed this in future games. I watched a little bit of a playthrough for Avernum 3, and when I say a little bit of a playthrough, I mean like just a few minutes. And the reason I say that is because I am going to play Avernum 3 at some point. I'm going to say at that point that I'm playing it blind, and I don't want people to point out this video as an example of me being dishonest. So when I say that they fixed it, what they've done is they've shown indicators of where your character is going to go. So if you have a character selected and you highlight over a certain cell, it'll show you like the path they're going to take to get there. And that would be useful, because it would show you if your character is going to run off in some wild direction. It doesn't prevent them from doing so, but it will kind of give you that visual cue that, hey, maybe you want to direct this a little bit better. Maybe you want to be a little bit more hands-on and micromanage this a little bit. But of course that doesn't exist yet in Avernum 1, and so I guarantee as you're playing this game you'll have a character just suddenly run off from time to time. Now, another nitpicky complaint that I have is that it can be hard to click on a given enemy when several of them are clumped together. There's not really a visual indicator, or at least not an obvious one, of which enemy you're hovering over, and so it's easy to accidentally attack an enemy that's not what you intended. Now, to offset this, and this is actually how I played most of the time, you can just use keyboard shortcuts. Each enemy is given an alphabetic designation in battle, So you'll have like enemy A, B, C, D, etc. And so you can click A to attack, and then click B to attack enemy number B, or enemy letter B. However, the problem with that is that as enemies die, and as new enemies join the fight, those designations will change. And so the enemy that's enemy B this turn may not be enemy B next turn. And if you use minions, if you summon minions, then this is going to bug you even more. Because you'll try to attack the same enemy you attacked last round, only to get a pop-up asking, are you sure you want to attack this minion? And of course you don't. But if you're not paying attention, you just kind of click through, things can go wrong pretty quick, because you will attack that minion, and now that minion is hostile to all of your characters. And so now you've just added someone else to the fight that is now fighting you. The last complaint I have about this is that it's not always clear when you've learned a new battle discipline. If you keep most of the common skills that you use in your toolbar, which is something that I did, then you probably won't visit the battle discipline screen all that often. And so I remember at one point I'd gained several levels, and I thought, well, I might as well check and see if my archer has gotten any new battle disciplines. And I opened up that screen, and sure enough, not only had he learned new battle disciplines, he had learned almost all of them. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I wasn't paying attention, or maybe I should have been checking the battle screen or battle discipline screen more often. But I definitely felt a little cheated. Like, wow, I could have been using these abilities all along, and some of them look like they could have been helpful at certain times. But it wasn't game breaking. It was just something to be aware of. And it's also worth noticing, or pointing out rather, that I didn't have this problem with spells. When you get new spells, you have to do something kind of intentional to get them. You have to talk to someone, and you gotta get trained in it, or you have to read a magical tomb. There's always something that you do to get a new spell, and so when you learn a new spell, you know that you've done it, unless you're just really, really being careless. Now, I mentioned that in combat you can use scrolls and potions, and you can also use something called crystals, and all of these have some sort of effect on your party or the enemies during battle. And you do that as a minor action, and as you're exploring the world, you will find a ton of crafting materials. You'll find papyrus, ink, balances, alchemy sets, herbs, containers, tools, ore, pickaxes, just a ton of crafting material. So you might infer from those two facts that those materials can be used to craft potions and scrolls and probably some gear. That's definitely what I thought as well. And I was actually hoarding those crafting items, and was genuinely confused when I got several hours into the game, and I still didn't know how to craft anything. And so I finally went to Google, and I Googled, how do I find a trainer to help with crafting in Avernum 1? And that's when I learned the surprising and disappointing truth, that there is no player crafting in this game. And I cannot describe just how disappointed I was that after picking up a ton of papyrus and ink and really just hoarding those things, that my priest could not make use of them to create new scrolls. You can't use alchemy, you can't make potions, you can't craft gear, and as for the tools you pick up, such as there's even things there's little things that look like tongs that you would use maybe in blacksmithing. And there's pickaxes, as I mentioned, and there's shovels, and there's just all this stuff. And for the most part, those things are useless. They're just there to sell, and they don't sell for much. And so it's kind of baffling to me. And I can't confirm this, but I do suspect that maybe crafting was meant to be in the game, but then was just never implemented. The reason I say that is because the items are just so clearly meant to be crafting. I mean, I could be wrong, but I really do think that's the case, and I really hope that there's player crafting in the sequels. You might have mentioned you might have noticed that I keep saying player crafting, and the reason for that is because there technically is a type of crafting. You can take your herbs to alchemists, and they can create potions for you, and I highly recommend that you do that. I made the mistake of thinking that since all the other crafting items were junk, that the herbs were junk too, and selling them off, and that really hurt me late game. Late game, I found myself really needing a certain type of potion, and not having the materials to craft it, and not being able to find the materials because I had harvested so many of them and then ended up selling them. So just be aware of that. So yeah, don't get rid of your herbs. Don't the papyrus, the ink, the alchemy supplies, you can sell those. But hold on to the herbs. You'll run into people that can make use of them, and you'll be so happy that you did. Alright, Avernum has some puzzles, so I suppose I should talk about them. I didn't like them. They are maze puzzles and switch puzzles for the most part, and I really just don't dig those types of puzzles. They're totally appropriate for the time that the original games came out. The early Final Fantasy games, which came out just before, a few years before, and were coming out around the same time, they have those same types of puzzles, but you know what? I didn't like those either. As someone who's just not very clever, I guess, I like my puzzles that make me feel clever. And the puzzles in Avernum were more of like a brute force thing. I didn't really enjoy them. I just kind of endured them until they were over so I could get back to playing the real game. Now, there's something else that the game does that I gotta complain about. Sometimes, when you are partway through a dungeon, all of a sudden everything will go dark. And so what does that mean? It means that the space around you that you can see, it suddenly constricts to like 2 or 3 squares at most. And all of the map that you've explored thus far is suddenly gone. It's just black. And your mini-map also becomes useless. And this is something that I did not enjoy a whole lot. I really detested those parts of the game, to be honest. And at one point, towards the end of the game, you have a switch puzzle that you have to complete in complete darkness. It is horrendous. And really, if I could change one thing, aside, of course, from the pathfinding, it would be that. I absolutely loathed that section. I didn't find it fun at all. I brute forced anytime I had those sections. I just kind of brute forced it, and then when it was done, I took a break from the game and made a sandwich or something because I just need to get up and walk away for a little bit. And I mean, I wasn't angry. I didn't like. It wasn't like that. It was just like it was so grueling and such a brute force thing that you just gotta step away for a little while after that. Now, in the game, you do pick up a lot of like lanterns and candles, and so you might make the reasonable assumption that having that might make your life easier in those dark areas. That is not the case. What those devices do is they make the screen brighter, but they don't expand how far you can see, which is really odd to me. It's kind of an odd mechanic that actually, if it's not going to do anything useful, just don't let it do anything at all. But it is what it is. Puzzles and darkness is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a match made in hell. And I love this game, but I could definitely do without those parts. So let's talk about something that I did enjoy, because I've been kind of harping on the game a little bit for the past couple minutes. So let's talk about something that was fun for me, and that's the quests. Quests in Avernum, I think, are fantastic, and they're not fantastic just because of themselves. I mean, there's a few like fetch and kill quests and stuff, which are pretty run-of-the-mill. They're good because of the stories that they're a part of. If you're sent to gather something, which I don't even remember a quest that asks you to gather anything, but if that quest exists, if you're asked to do something, it's for a good reason. And if you're asked to kill someone or to kill something, it's for a good reason. And one of the things that's cool is about this game is that if you are sent to kill something or someone, you can get there and you almost always have the option to like not kill it, to not do it. And that's pretty cool. Back at the beginning of this video, I talked about how I thought of my party as being basically innocent victims of the Empire, who were basically good people. Well, a lot of the choices that I made in the game, they put that to the test, and they changed it. My party were not the same people at the end of the game that they were in the beginning. They made some hard choices, and to be honest, they did some terrible things. There's one choice that I made in particular that really stuck with me afterwards, and I was thinking about it that night, and I was like, man, I wonder if that was like really the best choice I could have made in that situation. And it was tough, but at the time I thought, well, this is what's best for Avernum, and given that Avernum is such a hostile place, and when we talk about Avernum, there's kind of the place of Avernum, which is the subterranean area that you wander through, but there's also like a kingdom of Avernum where it's like, the people of Avernum, as opposed to like the Nephilim or the Sliths and whatnot. And so I was thinking, if I do this thing, it's good for the people of Avernum, but it is something that's kind of, how do I say it? It's a tough decision. I really don't want to spoil it, and so I'm having a hard time describing it, but it was a tough decision, and it was in the favor of the people of Avernum. And so I made the situation, but I was thinking, I hope I don't have to. I hope I didn't make the wrong choice. And later on in the game, not too much later. I mean, this comes up pretty quick. Only a few hours of gameplay afterwards. But you get insight into something if you're paying attention that kind of recontextualizes that choice, and changes the way you feel about it. And so when that happened, and I'm not going to tell you for sure which one, I either was very happy that I'd made that choice because I'd saved the people of Avernum a lot of trouble, or I had felt extremely bad for making that choice because it wasn't what I thought it was. And so one of those things is true, and it actually doesn't matter which one is true because there are a lot of situations like that in the game, and sometimes one way is true and sometimes another way is true. And that's something that I love about the game. That's just how it was written, is that you get into these situations a lot and you have to make these choices. And even after finishing the game, you may not know whether or not that was a great choice to make. And so that's why I say that the people in my party were not the same at the end of the game at all that they were at the beginning. And that choice that I had to make, and all those choices, I shouldn't say all of them, not all of them, but that particular choice that I used in my example, that choice came about because of a quest. Now, to be clear, the quest didn't tell me what choice to make. The quest didn't even prepare me that that would be a choice. I was just suddenly there, and the choice also was there, and it was like a situational thing. And so that's kind of what I mean about the story and the quests working together. Like, I went to that place because of the quest, but the choices that were there and kind of the story of that area existed independently of the quest. It was just the quest that led me there. And most of the quests in Avernum are kind of like that. They're all kind of vague, to be honest, but they're also clear. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, so let me give you an example. At one point in the game, you get a quest, and I don't think this is a big spoiler. This might be a little bit of a spoiler, so fast forward maybe a minute and a half or so. At one point in the game, you get a quest about people being attacked by the undead. The quest giver thinks that has something to do with an old crypt that's up north, and so he asks you to go up there and see what's going on. And really, that's it. Like, that's the quest. And it's clear. I consider it clear because you know what the problem is, and you know where to go to investigate. But aside from that, it's really up to you. You get up there and you kind of have to learn for yourself what's going on. And in that way, it's vague. Only after you get there and go through that cave do you find out what's really going on. And a lot of times in Avernum, rather than an NPC doing like an exposition dump and telling you what's going on, you go back to them and tell them what's going on. And I like that. A lot of quests are NPCs asking you to investigate rumors or to look into something that they've experienced. And sometimes that leads to like killing a bad guy or, getting a MacGuffin. But a lot of times it doesn't. All in all, despite its flaws, I really did enjoy this game. I think it offers a lot in the way of story, exploration, and even combat. And if it's lacking in some other areas, well, no game is perfect. So you might be wondering, should you play this game? And the answer is maybe. If you like interesting stories, you like making meaningful choices, and really if you can hang with the old school graphics and turn-based combat, then I think you should give it a shot, especially if what I've said so far makes it sound interesting. And that's kind of how I got turned on to the game, actually. Well, in a roundabout way. I'll go into that later, I think. To be honest, though, I'm really surprised that this series isn't more popular, because it really is a great game. And if this is just the first in the series, I'm definitely going to play the other two games in the series, and I can't imagine that they get any worse. In fact, I know for a fact that Avernum 3 is considered the flagship product of Spiderweb Services, or Spiderweb Software, and so I'm excited to play those games. It took me about 62 hours, I think, after double checking. I think it's about 62 hours to finish, and I didn't really get close to 100%ing it. There's still a lot left for me to do in Avernum if I wanted to go back and do it. And I don't know if I'll play Avernum 1 again. And really the only reason, though, is because there's an Avernum 2 and an Avernum 3. If this was a standalone game, and not the first in a trilogy, then my answer would be yes, absolutely, I'd play it again. I'd play with a different party, and I'd make different choices, and I would see what happens. But as it is, I am very excited to play Avernum 2 and 3. And actually, if you go back to the remakes in the early 2000s, there's, I believe, 6 or 7 games in the series. And so as far as the ones that were published 2011 onward, it's a trilogy. But, who knows? If I get done with 3 and I need some more, maybe I'll go back and play some of those older ones. And of course, as I play at least 2 and 3, as I play those, I'll make videos for those as well. Now, if you've gotten to this point and you do want to play the game, then the video is really over for you. You should stop watching right now and go play the game, because I am about to spoil the hell out of it. Now, if you've already played, or you just don't care about spoilers, then stick around. So here we go. From this point onward, there are going to be full spoilers. So you've been warned, and if you're still around, I imagine that you want to hear the spoilers. And here they are. At the end of this game, there are 3 end game quests. And these are quests where when you've completed it, you've essentially completed the game. Any one of them, or all 3, it's really up to you. And that doesn't mean the game kicks you out, though. I completed all 3 quests, and I could still play. I could still log in and not log in. You don't have to log in. I could still boot up the game and go through and play to my heart's content. There's still stuff left to do. There's still achievements to get. There's still quests to complete. I'm sure, side quests at least. So those 3 endgame quests, though, one of them is to defeat the demon Grahoth. He threatens to destroy Avernum, and Avernum is not safe until he's defeated. That's the first thing. And I'm kind of putting these into an order, which is why I say first, second, third, and such, but really there's no order. You could complete these in any order. You could just not complete them at all and keep doing side quests and exploring. You could do whatever you want here. You could do 2 out of the 3. It really doesn't matter. It's really up to you. So defeating Grahoth is the first one I'm talking about. The second one is to find an escape from Avernum and back into the surface world. And the third is to kill Emperor Hawthorne. And when you do that, you effectively start a war with the surface. And like I said, those endings all exist, but you can do all of them, you can do none of them, you can do a subset, it's up to you. And to be honest, like I said, I completed all 3. And I kind of wish I hadn't, because that's not who my party was. It didn't take very long for me to play where I kind of stopped caring about the Empire. It was like, Avernum is these people's home now, and, it's all about keeping them safe. And you do meet a lot of people in the game who talk about wanting to go back home to the surface. They have families there and whatnot. And so I kind of felt bad for them, and I think that my party would have done the quest of finding a way out of Avernum, if only to help those people who had become their friends over time. But, I mean, as far as my party, assuming they didn't have any family or anything on the surface, which, I didn't really build that out for them, so I'm going to say that they didn't, I think they would have just stayed in Avernum, and just settled in. So the first quest that I completed was kind of in line with that. It was the demon quest, defeating Grahoth. And it was a tough quest. In fact, during one playthrough, all of my party died except for the archer. And he had such a high dodge rate that really nothing could touch him. And on top of that, I had him drink an invincibility potion. And so he was just untouchable. And despite the fact that he really didn't do a whole lot of damage at this point, he's the one who ended up killing Grahoth. But unfortunately, there were so many enemies around. He was surrounded. And, I mean, just a ton. And eventually the invincibility potion wore off, and then pretty soon enough of those demons got lucky hits that, enough lucky hits that he ended up dying. And so it was kind of interesting because you get medals throughout the game as opposed to achievements. And maybe there are achievements if you play on Steam. I did not play on Steam. But you get these medals, and one of the medals that I got was the medal that you get for killing Grahoth, and I got that before I had actually killed him, because I still had to go back and actually kill him and then save a game after that. So I got the medal with still having to go back and defeat him, which I thought was kind of amusing. Now, speaking of those medals, actually, just a quick aside, I only got 27, and there are 35 total. And one of those has to do with getting potions made, and so I kind of hosed myself on that, right, because I sold most of my herbs. But there's hidden caches in the game, and supposedly there's 40, but I only ever found 28. And to be honest, I have no idea where the other ones can be. Supposedly there's 12 more out there somewhere. I am intrigued though by the idea that there's some secret area of Avernum that I just never discovered. That I just it's out there somewhere. Maybe I have to do something to open it up or something. I have no idea. But I am intrigued by that idea. And the more time that passes, the more I think I might actually just kind of log in or boot up the game every now and then, just go and see what I can find. After defeating Grahoth, though, I went and killed Emperor Hawthorne. And like I said, that's not one that my party would have done. They did not have the motivation for it. The only reason I did it, really, was because I knew I'd be making this video, and I wanted to have completed all 3 quests in the game. And in retrospect, that's not even a great reason. I could probably have done this video fine without having done that. So, am I happy I did that? I don't know. It's not something my party would have done. Maybe the video would have been less comprehensive if I hadn't done it. I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But, I'm not talking about... Well, I guess I am. I guess I had to do it in order to make this video, because I am going to talk about the fallout from killing the Emperor. But it's not something that my party would have done, and that's kind of the point, is that, like, going back to the beginning, when I said that you should determine for yourself who your party are and what they're, why they're in Avernum. It kind of goes back to that, because maybe your party would kill the Emperor, and it just so happens that mine wouldn't have. They didn't care anymore. Like I mentioned, I do think that my party would have gone and found a way to the surface. I don't think it would have been their main motivation, though. I think they would have defeated Grahoth and maybe taken some time off and then gone and explored and found the way out of Avernum, simply because there's so many people, like I mentioned, in Avernum that want to go back to the surface. And if you have the ability to help those people, why would you not? And then after doing that, Avernum's pretty much safe. Now, presumably... Well, I shouldn't say presumably. There are hostile forces from the Empire that you meet in Avernum, and they're kind of scouting it out, and there's this implication that they're going to attack. That the surface is going to see how well Avernum is doing and kind of recognize them as a threat, and they're going to come down and attack you. And so the reason that you go and kill Emperor Hawthorne, one of the reasons, is that presumably by defeating him you would lessen the power of the Empire, and you'd make that upcoming battle easier in some way. Or maybe even not take place, because Emperor Hawthorne is such an aggressor that by taking him out, whoever comes to fill that power, that vacancy in power, that maybe they wouldn't care. But to be honest, I never really found that argument to be convincing. Mainly because it really seems to me that they're going to attack either way. The people that you find, they're all talking very derogatorily about the Avernum. How would you say it? The Avernites. And I think that war is inevitable. And I was never really convinced that killing Emperor Hawthorne would do anything to prevent or lessen that. And in fact, after you do kill him, you learn that if anything, you've made war only that much more inevitable, and it's only going to happen that much sooner. So, anyway, I thought about carrying my party into Avernum 2 and 3, and I don't even know if that's possible. I haven't gotten into those games yet, so I don't know if that's possible. But I kind of think that I wouldn't do that. I think that I would leave my party as they were in Avernum. Because, as in kind of my head canon of this, eventually they would go to war, and I think they would help to fight the Empire, and maybe that's what Avernum 2 is about. But I think that really what they would want to do after kind of doing this whole thing of like saving Avernum and stuff, I think they'd want to settle. And so I think they would have settled somewhere like Contra, and I say Contra because, it has the boats there, and my party owned like 3 or 4 boats by the end of the game. And from there you can sail up to various settlements, you can sail down, you can do whatever you want. And so I like to think that that's what my party did. They just kind of settled down and started to live lives of peace, and maybe not peace, but eventually peace, I would like to think, in Avernum. So anyways, you know what, that's it for me. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and give it a subscribe. And if you like this video, or if anything in this sparked any interest in you whatsoever about the Avernum series, check out the links below, go to the Spiderweb Software site, and download a demo. They are free, and they're like 20-30 hours long. They're not short demos. You will definitely know by the time you finish the demo whether or not you want the full game. And you know what? They're not super expensive. I think I got my copy for like $10 on GOG. And so, they're not super expensive. They're kind of getting older at this point, especially Avernum 1. It's been 11 years since it was released, so it's never going to be super expensive. And so, give it a try, see if you like it, and if you like it, why not support Spiderweb Software? They did a great thing by putting this game together, and I really think it's worth it. And with 62 hours of gameplay, and I still didn't even get close to fully completing the thing, I think I more than got my money's worth. So anyways, I will be playing Avernum 2 and 3 at some point in the future, and I will cover those as well, because this is just a great series, and I want to keep going. So until then,